Hello, Internet. Gino, that Gino Greco here again with another episode of Deep Listens. And today, for this week's off-week podcast, I thought we could discuss something that's a little bit outside of necessarily just gaming, but something that's come up in pop culture and in gaming in the last few years, and that is the idea of conclusions. Finales, finishes, three, or depending on what fiction you actually care about, there could be 2, 3, or more giant sagas that have recently ended after multi-year lead-ups. One, obviously, the Avengers quadrilogy with dozens of movies in between the different Avengers films. That entire saga has just concluded. Game of Thrones just finished last week, I believe, or 2 weeks ago, depending on when this podcast goes up. And War of the Spark in Magic the Gathering just closed. And there's a bunch of other pieces of fiction, long-running pieces of fiction, that are ending soon. So I thought, why not have a discussion about why end things? How do you do it? Because it seems like some of these endings, like the Avengers, people liked quite a bit. Game of Thrones, less so. So to help me have this discussion, I thought, why not bring in our academic expert, Pete the Finisher Busby.
What's going on, everybody? Happy to be here. This is a subject that has, gaming worth, movie worth, and literary worth, so it's worth discussing. For this week's fun fact, simple one, but I heard today and it blew my mind. Maybe you won't find it as interesting as I do, but all your visible skin is dead. We only see dead skin whenever we look at each other, which is crazy to me.
Well, it does fall off pretty soon thereafter.
Yes, it does. It's
Just
called
like
the horny layer.
It's called what?
The horny layer.
Say it again.
It's the horny layer.
Oh, that's great. Well, I'm horny all over.
Let's just do this for the podcast.
Let's go to the podcast. Okay, so we don't have any emails because it's an off-week podcast, but if you want to get in touch with the show, do so at DeepListensPod on Twitter, deeplistens.libsyn.com. We've got our comment sections, and deeplistenspodcast@gmail.com. So, Pete, what do you think about conclusions in fiction? Because, every story has to have an ending, literally. Like, there has to be a point where it stops. But
True.
Not everything has to have a conclusion.
No. So here's what I'll say, right? The place I want to start, and this isn't the most literary place, but I think it's maybe a more interesting place, perhaps, is with the economics of the whole thing.
That's some place I was definitely going to go to, so good.
So I want to start with Sherlock Holmes, then. So, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, right? Famous author of the Sherlock Holmes series, as I hope you know.
Yes.
Okay.
I did know that. I know that because I watched Case Closed, and the main character's name is Conan, and it was a reference.
Excellent. That's all I ask. So long as you know it, I don't care how, even if your reason's dumb like that one.
It's the worst one.
So Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, he got sick of writing Sherlock Holmes books after, I think, the 5th one. So he killed him. Sherlock Holmes died. Sorry to,
Spoilers.
130-page book for you. But Sherlock Holmes dies in a fight with his arch nemesis, Moriarty. Because Arthur Conan Doyle was like, I'm sick of these. I want to get away from it. And people were pissed. One of the best analogies I saw was, it was like if J.K. Rowling just killed Harry Potter after the 5th book.
That'd be pretty awesome.
Yeah. People lost their minds. And eventually his fans, and perhaps more importantly, his editors, prevailed on him to bring Sherlock Holmes back, which he finally did, and he published some prequels and sort of pseudo-sequels and things that sort of didn't invalidate the death, so to speak. But the point really is that I think even more contemporarily, it happened in the past, but I think it's happening more and more, is we just don't allow things to end because there's a lot more money in keeping them going.
Yeah. And I think some great examples of that are the Star Wars movies, which have now had 3 different trilogies.
And a 4th is on the way.
A fourth is on the way, and they've started to fill in gaps with off-year movies as well. So that saga, they continue to just gin up more and more fiction that plays on the same, like, 2 or 3 themes over and over and over again because it can never end. I think another one that people who listen to this podcast might be familiar with is Final Fantasy XIII, which originally was supposed to have 1 game, and then it became 3 when they realized that they were not going to be able to put out another piece of fiction in a reasonable amount of time. So they just kept stretching and stretching and stretching until the final game takes place in, I think, the literal end of the world?
Yeah, anytime you see, like, 13.2 is gibberish. I don't mean the game, I mean, like, the literal title is gibberish, which should be a sign for you.
Fortunately for you, the game is also gibberish.
Excellent.
Yeah, there are time paradox. I'm going to have to play that at some point, and it hurts me inside. But I think, what do you something that springs to mind is when you start seeing this pattern repeat itself over and over and over again, where characters are not allowed to die, stories are not allowed to end. At this point, the audience kind of expects that a story will continue in perpetuity as well, right? Like, if you're a fan of a particularly popular show or something, sitcom, anything, you kind of expect it to go on and on and on and on. But some stories, I think, are episodic and really can do that, like Dragon Ball, for example, is a good one. That one, you know, there's always another villain. You can always come up with another reason for people to be punching each other.
Sure, but then eventually you run into the, I think Billy's made this reference before, you run into the Gurren Lagann situation, where the enemies just have to get bigger and bigger and crazier until you're basically fighting the whole universe.
Yeah, or you need to reset.
Yes.
There's power creep, and then you eventually do a reset. Yes. But at least then you can keep doing it without the story becoming nonsense, necessarily. Mm-hmm. Like, One Piece has been going on now for, 20 years? 15 years?
Forever. I mean, I got to, like, episode 800, and I'm now hundreds of episodes behind again.
Yeah, so shows like that are episodic, or even, sitcoms, Friends, Big Bang Theory, shows like that just are trying to churn out 30-minute segments. One Piece is churning out a few episode arcs instead of a 30-minute chunklet, but the overarching stories are kind of secondary to the moment-to-moment action, and you kind of have an expectation that this is a formulaic process that could continue for forever. But now it feels like even the stories that are supposed to be contained discrete units are always being added to this larger, I guess, franchise that has to be kept in mind.
I think it's worth sort of untangling a few different paradigms here, where, like, you wouldn't say, like, Friends, right, has an extended universe. Rather, what keeps Friends going is that there's really no consequences from episode to episode, right? I think the best example of this is I've always thought a dumb show, but remember Entourage?
Yes, but I didn't watch it. I hated people who watched it.
Sure, Silicon Valley is sort of the same basic deal.
Yeah,
but the whole point is nothing really. There are no consequences, right? Everything's always going to work out in the end. And this is sort of why you can just keep going, because all right, we're just going to be back at starting, square one, basically, more or less, when we go. And this is sort of the paradigm of Shakespearean comedies, right? Like, not all of them do, but one of the hallmarks of Shakespeare's comedies is that they all end in marriage. Because one, it sort of creates a hard stop, but it sort of just brings you to a new origin point. Like, okay, we can now keep going. I mean, Shakespeare didn't, but he could have. Right? You don't see necessarily those sort of hard stops, but if you do, it allows it to keep going just with a slightly tweaked paradigm.
That makes sense. And I think that that formula has definitely been applied to a lot of different genres and movies.
Yeah.
Shows, all sorts of stuff just ends in a marriage or ends in, I guess, a defeat of a villain, a marriage, or a death tends to be the big conclusions.
Yeah, and then we're just back sort of at square one. Or the other paradigm you have is the extended universe, where we sort of have this core group perhaps, and then we sort of just fill in the areas around them, right? Like, this is the Avengers setup until we hit a hard reset, in which case, we're just keeping the archetypes, but bringing in new people to fill the suits, so to speak.
Yeah, and then those people some of them will fill them for, like, we need these powers to be available. Some of them will fill, this is the funny, brainy guy. This is, archetypes in multiple direction.
Yes.
Young would love it.
He probably would. I mean, he'd probably be high on cocaine, too. So, I mean.
So he would really love it.
Yeah, he'd be really on board.
Yeah, so I guess when you have these different available paradigms here, that's, I guess, the franchise paradigm where there are conclusions, but every conclusion builds on top of itself. You've got the kind of serialized paradigm where every 30, there's no consequences after everything.
No. Yeah.
Do you see any third option here? I mean, there's the discrete contained story that is planned to tell a particular arc and then be done.
The other one, I like to think of Charles Dickens in this way. This one's sort of cheating, but like Charles Dickens' whole deal, people like to say he was paid by the word. He wasn't really, but it's a fun story and it fits with his book, so why not? But what he would do is he would chop things up, right? He lived in the age of the serial novel. So one way, if you want to avoid concluding as long as possible, is to just break up your main story into as many smaller chunks as you possibly can. So like this isn't the same sort of perpetual continuation model, but rather it's, okay, I need to force people to maintain, basically I need to force people to buy more.
Yeah.
Right? He's the Spotify to the 1800s CD, right? You're not paying for a product. You're basically paying a subscription model for as long as Charles Dickens can keep chopping up this story.
Sure, but what do you think the incentives of, I mean, I guess we're going to talk about capitalism, but does the incentive structure... Don't we always? But obviously there's a incentive here to continue propagating a story for as many discrete units of payment as you can, and so it favors serialized shows like Friends or something that is within a franchise, whereas a single discrete artistic work now is not valuable enough to kind of keep an entire crew or an entire company employed in perpetuity. Like, if you have a very specific story you want to tell in, like, 10 episodes or 15 episodes, that's not a thing that gets greenlit very often outside of prestige television.
No, I think even the larger issue is one of risk management, too. Like, you're dealing with, if you're starting with a completely new IP, right, there's no telling how much success it's going to have, which becomes increasingly problematic as the budgets for things like AAA games or huge movies grows and grows and grows. As the budget grows, the risk grows. So the easiest way to minimize that risk is to start with a property you already know should be successful. Right? That's why Avatar is getting a sequel. Nobody gives a shit about Avatar. But the first one made so much money they can at least basically justify the outlay for a second.
Sure. And it was definitely heavily watched. I don't know if the novelty of slightly better 3D will be there the second time. Well,
you can see even more hairs.
Oh, wow. This time when they go to the tree of boning, it comes right at you. Yeah, I guess with conclusion, like, I know that there's more risk in discrete units, and that kind of incentivizes you to give those little risks smaller budgets. And so you kind of have to, if you know something is going to have a discrete conclusion and can't just become a gold mine, you're going to give it a small budget, give it a short leash, and then let it go if it's unsuccessful. But what about the little shows and little events that are discrete units that have a niche audience and have some artistic merit regardless, and then that an end is coming, but it's architected, how long you're trying to work it. Do you think those sorts of projects can exist, shouldn't exist?
I would like if they did more. I just think they're getting squeezed out by these sort of, there's only so much entertainment budget to go around. If you looked at, like Adorno, right, when he's talking about the culture industry, if he was looking at this, he'd say, listen, this is nothing new, right? Like even when you had these sort of discrete units, right, things that were ending and they were finished, he would say these are still just retreads of formulas, right? Like it's all the hero's journey, no matter how we package it. Now things are just a little bit more obvious about it. Now, I'm not that pessimistic as Adorno, but I think you could come from this perspective like, look, we're just being more obvious about a process that always existed. You know what I mean?
Yeah, but I guess what I'm thinking is in the Marvel context, or I think Marvel is really the one where you can see the franchiseification.
Oh yeah, I mean they start, even if they're not the most obvious, still they got the ball rolling.
Yeah, I mean the Avengers movies are these heroes' journeys that are scaffolded together by smaller heroes' journeys.
Mm-hmm.
Do you watch Rick and Morty at all?
Yeah, I do, much to my chagrin sometimes.
It's Million Ants.
Yes.
It's Million Ants, the franchise. Like, each one is its own discrete little hero's journey, but then when they all come together, they're one gigantic hero's journey.
Yeah. And it's richer for its Voltroning.
Yeah, and you kind of you get some crossbreeding here and there between the different storylines, and you get to delve into different genres even, because each discrete hero's journey can have its own, like, specific franchise rules. Like, there's sub-franchises inside of it, and each one has their own tone. So you can get a little bit more, but then when the conclusion comes, you understand that no conclusion is ever really a conclusion in that universe, right? It all has to be able to spin off. You can have a satisfying end to a character or to a storyline, but you know that the world must go on. Whereas there's something about playing just a single work where you know that when it's done,
mm-hmm.
and it probably won't continue, and it was planned to be as long as it is. And you can tell, at least I can, when I'm watching something or reading something that suddenly becomes a franchise that was not intended to be a franchise, like Mass Effect, for example. The first game, I think, ends well. If that was the last game, there was obviously a bunch of foreshadowing, but it felt like that game did not necessarily know that a sequel was coming.
Mm-hmm. You know what I always think about when I'm thinking about a subject like this is Jaws. Like in the first movie, they kill the shark, and then somehow we get Jaws the Revenge. This time it's personal, and it's like the shark's mother or something shows up. I forget exactly what happens, but that's clearly a case where things were supposed to end, but they were like, well, shit, we have all this money. Like, Jaws the Revenge, bring the shark back.
Yeah, or another one, Final Fantasy X. That game ends with, like, some pretty significant plot points that makes it so that there's no clear sequel that's set up. Like, the world is at war, and then by the end of, or like being terrorized by a giant monster, and by the end of it, there is peace. And then there's a 10-2, and it's a J-pop extravaganza. Because they didn't know how to end it.
They're like, shit, what do we do?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, it's a ridiculous thing. They take a character who's very serious and they turn her into a J-pop singer, basically, and pop star.
I agree with you. Part of the problem is when you have these things that are always continuing, you necessarily circumscribe the amount of emotions you can ask your audience to feel. Like, in order for something to continue, it pretty much has to end in a triumph for the protagonist. Right? Like, if Endgame finished after the first movie, that would have been super interesting. But you can't continue something after a global, complete defeat like that. You know what I mean? So, like, we now get rid of loss, defeat, failure, depression, right? Sadness. These are no longer options. Eventually, given a long enough time frame, you know things are going to come to triumph in the end.
Yeah, and I think that Endgame actually... I guess it's not Endgame. What's the latest? The latest one's Endgame, right?
Yeah, it's still Endgame. I don't know.
It was Infinity War, then Endgame.
Yes, correct.
I found the most interesting moments of Endgame to be when they're living in a post-apocalyptic world where Thanos won, and everyone's dealing with PTSD, and like large swaths of Earth have just been left abandoned because, hey, we're not going to take all those cars off the freeway that crashed when all the people who drove them went away.
Yeah, we certainly don't have the manpower for it anymore. Yeah,
they only dwell in that world for like a half hour or so, if that. in a 3-hour movie, which actually feels short in a 3-hour movie. But it's not that much dwelling before it's a weird, like, time caper.
Mm-hmm.
You know? So it would have been interesting if that was the reset for the universe.
True, yeah, if they just went from there. That would have, I mean, then you have to have a whole bunch of new origin stories, though, is the problem. Because, again, you're taking up these sort of anonymous mantles. But, I mean, those are always, the origin stories are always my favorite part anyway.
And they're clearly Marvel's favorite part because they just keep introducing characters.
True.
It's not like the Avengers need to have everyone who's ever been an Avenger. But they just keep introducing folks. Yeah, I guess that conclusion was pretty satisfying. Why don't we look at something that I guess is a little bit less satisfying? I found, or maybe another tack at it. We've been talking about how conclusions for stories that have to continue kind of necessitate a victory on the hero's part.
Yes.
But does it also strongly disincentivize, like, killing any characters ever? Or all but the most obvious? Because in the 3 big franchises that actually, I think they all pretty much lined up on a weekend. War of the Spark for Magic the Gathering came out the same weekend as Endgame. And then Game of Thrones ended. I think the Battle for Winterfell happened that weekend.
Mm-hmm.
And then the conclusion was like 3 weeks later. So these 3 gigantic franchises happened to have their cataclysmic endgames on the same weekend. And in all 3 cases, they were making the argument that, hey, this is the final conclusion. Everyone is fair game to live or die.
True.
But because of, I don't know if it's because of the reality of having to keep the characters alive for story purposes or just the raw capitalistic, we need to keep as many characters in play that people care about as possible. But when you make the argument that anything can happen in this story, the stakes are very high, the danger is high, and then ultimately, if you look at them, the Battle for Winterfell, the only people who died were, and, spoilers for all of this stuff.
Yeah, this is an episode about endings.
This is an episode about endings, all spoilers.
You knew this was coming.
Yeah. So, in the Battle for Winterfell, the only people who died were a random... I mean, he's not random. One of the Night's Watch guys who's been around forever. A dude who rose from the dead like 12 times.
Yep,
so,
Beric Dondarrion.
Beric Dondarrion. We knew he was eventually going to die. They basically told him multiple times, like, you're alive because you need to get to a place to do a thing.
There was a countdown.
Yeah.
It was coming.
It was like in... is it American movie? What's the movie that Chris Evans was in? It was not another teen movie. Have you ever seen that?
Yeah. What about it?
Remember the football player who they have a sign that says how many concussions he has left until he can't play football anymore?
I do.
That was Beric Dondarrion with lives.
Yes.
They lose Lyanna Mormont, who apparently was not even supposed to be in that show for as long as she was, but the actress was just so good that they kept writing her bits.
Yeah, everybody loved her.
And Jorah, who survived, like, he should have been dead like 3 seasons ago.
Yeah.
He caught fantasy plague and then got over it.
Yep.
So all of these characters were living on borrowed time. Like, even the dude from the Night's Watch, like, the wall collapsed around him and he was okay. And so none of the characters who were of consequence really died there. In Endgame, we had Iron Man and Captain America basically getting taken out. But if you go in knowing that, all these characters are in play, and the only people you lose are the ones who've had their franchises end at natural points and whose contracts haven't been renewed. I mean, the second part is that's because we know about movies.
Yeah. You can read the tea leaves there, but it's not Avengers' fault.
Yeah, but if the only characters you lose are the ones who you started the franchise with, who have obvious replacements, like you've introduced characters who in the comic books have been Iron Man or Captain America in the past. I guess we lost Black Widow, but who cares? She doesn't get to do anything cool in any of the movies.
Is she gone now?
I mean, they're making a Black Widow movie, but I assume it's going to be a prequel because she dies. But,
Oh,
again...
right, yeah, I forgot she died.
Yeah, exactly. You forget she dies. Gamora, also still probably dead.
Yeah, but she still shows up because they screwed up time travel.
Yeah, because time travel. That they barely explain. It's fine. So, like, the only characters who died in those movies were the ones who they effectively wrung as much financial interest out of as they could. And then they replaced them with obvious replacements. And then in Magic, we ended up having... Like, the whole premise was that 32 or 36 planeswalkers, so the main characters of the storylines, were all trapped on one plane that is kind of the most popular plane in Magic history. And they were up against the main big bad who has trapped them all there, and his goal is to kill them all and steal their powers, basically. And 2 characters died of 32.
That's not a great percentage.
Yeah, Big Bad gets beaten. He betrays one of his allies, so one bad guy gets killed, and then one good guy sacrifices himself. And he is the, like, goodiest goody two-shoes, like, most obvious person to have die.
He's Superman in that universe?
Yeah, he's the planeswalker who's, like, the whitest of white characters, and I mean white in the terms of the 5 colors of Magic.
White Knight, yeah.
Yeah, he's the self-sacrifice guy. His power was invincibility and being a good leader. He's Captain America. He's a good leader.
Okay.
His power was leadership and getting hit really hard and always getting back up.
Sure, yeah.
So they've managed to, like, pull together this storyline with all these disparate threads and then say, okay, the danger's higher than ever. And it's sold on the danger being higher than ever. And going in, I actually believed it. And I don't know if I should feel stupid that I felt like the conclusions here might actually put multiple characters in play. And having their main characters die, I don't know. It really just kind of makes me feel like the universe has a little bit more variability and openness than it otherwise seems to. Because when you're keeping in mind constantly that there needs to be a sequel, there needs to be more story, it needs to continue, it shuts off all sorts of avenues of storytelling.
Yeah. I mean, at a certain point, do you remember the show Clone High?
Yes. I didn't watch it, but I know it existed.
So Clone High was, I don't even remember was it MTV?
I think so.
So Clone High was a show on MTV where they basically cloned a whole bunch of, it was a cloned a whole bunch of famous people without history, Abe Lincoln, Joan of Arc, Gandhi. And then they became high school age kids and sort of, it was a comedy playing out their adventures. That's not really the point here. The point is, Clone High had an episode where they mocked this whole paradigm, where they were like, listen, somebody's going to die this episode. But the point was, they introduced a new character no one had ever heard before, who was there solely to die. Right? I think it was Ponce de Leon was the historical figure.
Makes sense.
Exactly. Right? So at a certain point, that's your only recourse, is you need to introduce people solely so they can then be killed.
Yeah,
so
go ahead, finish your thought.
It's a very fine balancing act between, one, giving them enough time to develop, and so people, hopefully care about the death, but 2, not letting them spend so much time or do so much that people become too attached to them or they become too integral to the story. Because, again, they have to die in such a way that things can basically seamlessly continue.
Yeah, and that's actually what I thought was happening with Magic, because they introduced like 10 new characters or something in that ballpark. And some of them their cards were weak and their gimmicks were so specific that it felt like this gimmick will only support like 1 or 2 cards. So I, kill them. They're the red shirts, basically. It would make sense for them to die.
They're cannon fodder. They're the Light Brigade.
Exactly, but not even they were killed in the show, in the storyline. So I guess when you don't play into those expectations, or you don't subvert your expectations here or there, it kind of makes everything feel more on rails. Mm-hmm. And then the only people you can off are characters who have outlived their usefulness, and you can kind of work backwards from there. And as a, I guess, conscientious viewer of these shows, you can't help but start to see the artifice underneath them, right? And do you think seeing that scaffolding dampens the overall reception or your perception of works of fiction?
When you say scaffolding, you mean like understanding the plot beats, or understanding that like, no, because we need the show to keep going, we can basically see how this is going to turn out? Like, is this a thematic question or an economic question?
Well, it's kind of both.
Right.
Because you got one here. I'll go back to Game of Thrones for a bit, right? When the Battle for Winterfell happens and it ends the way it ends, or I guess it was the episode before the Battle for Winterfell, because they had 6 episodes left.
Yes.
And the episode before the Battle for Winterfell is mostly people talking and having a good time and like enjoying what might be their last day alive. And then I was just thinking about it and saying they have 4 episodes left and there are 2 villains left, which means that this has to go one of 2 ways. The Battle for Winterfell will be decisive. Humanity will win. Then we'll have an episode of like cooling down and going to face the foe at King's Landing. Then there'll be the battle for King's Landing. Then there will be the end, right?
Yes.
That's the only way this can go. Or the dead win at Winterfell. There's an episode of people fleeing to King's Landing. There's the last stand at King's Landing, and then the end. But those were the only 2 potential story beats that were available. And so you could kind of, because you knew how many episodes there were and how many storylines they felt they had to pay off, you can kind of see how the story must go. And being able to see that, it's not foreshadowing in the traditional sense, right? It's not like the story is telling you, dropping you little hints, you know. It's not Chekhov's gun. It's kind of the accountant's gun. Because you know, it's stuff secondary to the fiction that is providing you with the knowledge of where the story must go. And once you know that, then elements of the in-world and in-fiction universe kind of gets kind of becomes 2D. You start noticing that these people are actors and not characters.
Yeah, but this, I agree with you completely. I would just like to point out that this isn't necessarily a new problem. Like, I mean, I wouldn't say them. You know, even when they were publishing novels, right? Like, if you just hold a novel in your hand, you can look and see how many pages are left, and that'll tell you something about the story, right? Or with plays, like, you know, all right, if I show up to a 3-act play, or if I know that this play is going to be roughly 3 hours, that tells me something about how the story is going to head by the time I hit the end of Act 2. Like, I do think it's getting worse, but again, it's nothing new.
Yeah, but I guess it's maybe that we're dealing with things that are almost, the scope and the scale are so large and the lead time so large that there's such a buildup and sense of anticipation in the audience that if there are mishaps or if the track becomes obvious, you can almost feel the car crash happening long before it happens, you know?
True.
You're dealing with it for months or years, and you can see it coming. Whereas if it was a 3-act play, you know, you're 2-3 hours in, you know how it must end, but every moment is entertaining. There are no industries that are entirely propped up by what happens at the end of Wicked.
That's a good point. There's no, you know, post-play commentary podcasts.
Exactly. It's not like there's someone who's going to Wicked every night and telling you, hey, this time they tweaked it. And it's, here are the 10 secret things you can notice in the background of the set this week. Like, that would be pointless. And it makes discrete, it actually makes me appreciate these kind of discrete works more, because the work is what's central, not the take industry around it. And it makes, when the conclusion isn't foreshadowed for years or months or, you know, usually it's years at this point for most franchises, the stakes come down and I can just kind of appreciate the fiction and kind of get into it without knowing that this will be some zeitgeisty thing that must be dissected. And then you're putting a lot more weight onto these stories than they could possibly pay off.
Yeah. My question at this point, though, is basically the issue of audience relation to characters, right? Like, because you have a trade-off here. Like, people might want happy stasis.
Yep.
Right? They might want to know, okay, my favorite character's safe. He's happy. He's going to come back around. I'll get to see him again. But the trade-off you get, I mean, we sort of mentioned this already, is that everything then has lower stakes. You lose consequence. So like you have happy stasis. Basically what I'm saying is it's low ceiling, high floor, right? Like everything's going to stay in the range of like acceptable as opposed to being dramatic or thrilling or, surprising basically. And are we as an audience comfortable giving up twists for the sake of comfortable stasis?
I don't know that you necessarily give up twists.
Okay.
If you don't... So, not every story needs to be cataclysmic, world-ending franchise fare. And I think that you can have twists within stories that do not delve in the cosmic in the way that some of these larger franchises that we've been talking about do. And if you do that, then you can have these little character moments and bits of nuance that don't seem outclassed because of in-fiction problems. Like, if you're having an episode where people are discussing what they're going to do after a battle, and then the battle is against fucking zombies, their little personal character drama doesn't take on as much import, because at the end of the day, if they don't win, everything they've said doesn't matter. The existential threat becomes so central to the story that it eclipses all else. But if you're dealing in smaller stuff, then all of a sudden the human drama can matter the most.
True, but it's like you said, it's a question of consequence. So if I know, all right, this is season 1, they want 5 seasons of this thing. So whatever like twist happens ultimately can't change things too much. At that point, is it a twist or just variety? You know what I mean? Like if I pick a new cereal for breakfast, it's not a twist.
I guess... So, what types of, conclusions or storytelling do you enjoy then? Like, what are... I'm just trying to get at it, because I'm thinking the big franchise stuff, right? You have these constant twists, but the twists are all... They can't damage the overall vehicle, right? You can ding up a mirror, but you can't wreck the car. But when you deal in that sort of scale, it just makes it can make things more formulaic. Right? Whereas things like plays, smaller pieces of fiction, even, one-off games, they have the entire range of experience available to them. And I tend to just appreciate those stories, because they have a planned ending or a planned terminus that they're going to get to, and you know that it will not continue beyond it.
Yeah. No, I'd agree with you there. I mean, one of my biggest issues is, like I said, consequence, right? Like when Oedipus finds out that his wife's a mother, right? Like his mother, everything changes, right? This story will never be the same. We can never get back to the point we were at. That's what I want, is just some sense of forward progression. Whereas not to compare Oedipus and Avengers, but like even if somebody else puts on the Iron Man suit, what's the difference at a certain point? You know what I mean? Like we're basically back where we started.
The wisecracks will be worse.
Fair. And the facial hair will probably be worse too.
Facial hair will be worse. The suit will do the same things, generally speaking.
We have another hero.
Yeah. And I guess that's why I like the conclusion that I actually felt the most joy with recently was Crazy Ex-Girlfriend just ended. I don't know if you've ever watched that show.
I have not.
It was on the CW. It was one of the lowest rated shows in broadcast television history.
Excellent. You know what else just ended? Big Bang Theory. Let's never mention that ever.
Thank you for... We've said the words Big Bang Theory 3 times now on this podcast. Those will be the last 3 times we mention them, if we can avoid it.
Yes.
But it was one of the lowest rated shows because it was it was literally a musical comedy.
Really?
Yes, with original songs every single episode, at least 1 or 2.
Damn.
It was one of the most specific shows that I've ever seen, and as someone who's a fan of musical theater, it was right up my alley. It's a musical. It was a musical about a ex-girlfriend who's a lawyer who runs into her ex on the streets of New York City after having a panic attack because lawyerdom is stressful and intense.
Sure.
And she's from Scarsdale, New York. And decides that she doesn't want to be there anymore, and so she uproots her life on a whim to follow her ex-boyfriend to California. but like West Covina, California, not L.A.
It's very different things.
Yes. And it basically it follows her life as she is trying to make sense of her place in the world, get back with her ex-boyfriend, try to figure out what she wants, and they do a series of great songs to kind of explain, because her character kind of perceives the world as a Disney movie or as a musical.
Sort of like that Amy Adams movie.
Yes. Enchanted, is it?
Yeah, very good movie.
Yes, similar sort of idea, except there's not... She doesn't think she's a princess, literally.
Right.
But they do have princess songs and stuff like that.
Okay.
It's very clear that it's supposed to be kind of her delusion.
Sure.
But a lot of great songs, like I Gave You a UTI. That's a great song. That's a real song that's on the show.
It's a great title.
Yeah, it's really good. They got, in the first 2 seasons, the dude who voiced, is it Hans? Who's the guy in Frozen, the blonde guy?
Yeah, I know who you're talking about, but yeah, just pick some. It might be Hans, some standard.
It's the main love interest.
Yeah.
The guy who voices him is one of the main guys in that show.
Okay.
So he's a great singer. But that show very specifically was set up to be 4 seasons. And I don't see how that show would have been allowed to continue if it didn't have a terminus, because it was so low rated.
As in, it would have just been like an indeterminate money pit.
Exactly. They knew it was supposed to be 4 seasons. And because that it was supposed to be 4 seasons, it was allowed to continue for its natural conclusion.
Yeah. For
its actual natural conclusion. And it concluded in a way that was satisfying, because it was clear that they actually had a plan for how it was going to end. They actually knew what the conclusion was supposed to be. So the last episode actually isn't an episode of the show. They put on a live show for an hour.
Oh, that's cool.
And just did a review of some of the best songs live. So that story is a lot more grounded, and because they knew where they were ending, 1, the ending worked and was scaffolded in, and 2, it kind of led to a feeling for me where, I don't know, the universe made sense. It felt like a real lived-in world in a way that's something that must ever expand. And plot armor is constantly available, does not, you know?
You make me think of a question here, Gino, just based on you said, like, it was allowed to end. I'm curious who has, like, for a book, it's the author, but, like, for a TV show, who has ultimate ownership of the characters? Like, if HBO just decided, like, all right, we'll get rid of these 2 dudes, we'll bring in 2 new showrunners, and we'll just keep Game of Thrones running. Is there any way to stop that?
I think it depends on the show, who owns the intellectual property and the negotiation therein. Yeah. Because I know that, at least for Crazy Ex-Girlfriend, Rachel Bloom, the lead writer and star of the show, she's now doing, like, she did a few tour dates as, like, Crazy Ex-Girlfriend Live with a few of the actors of the show. And I think she still at least owns some of it, because otherwise... Or the CW is, like, licensing it out. But there's at least some ownership there.
Because I could very easily see, I mean, with the financial wherewithal that studios wield over, you know, writers who are typically, I shouldn't say typically, a writer's going to have less money than Marvel Studios, regardless of who they are.
Yeah.
You could very easily see Marvel wielding that bludgeon to sort of be like, all right, we own this now.
Yeah, and I think that for some circumstances they definitely do, right? Like Marvel Comics owns some of the characters that their creatives make, and so if those people want to continue working on the character they originated, they have to continue working for Marvel.
Yes.
But I guess something that we should get to is, like, what kind of conclusion do you enjoy? Because, like, for me, the Crazy Ex-Girlfriend finale, even though it didn't end necessarily the way I would have wanted, or the way I thought it would, it was satisfying for me because it tied up enough things. It left the characters in a place that I felt was realistic and felt earned, and it had the good sense to leave the world big enough that you can imagine it continuing, right?
Yeah.
There are some conclusions that, like, burn the whole thing down, and say, okay, there's nothing else after this because there is nothing after this.
True. Like Moby Dick isn't going to come around with like another one where like Ishmael goes back out for Moby Dick. Like that's just not going to, it's not going to do it.
The rise of Ahab.
Yeah, right. Like he drowned. Ahab's gone.
Yeah, and then there's the stories that don't end.
Mm-hmm. So I'll tell you what, Gino, I will answer it in reverse. So I can't remember ever being so desperate to spend more time with some characters that I wanted the story to keep going after it ended. Like, probably like Ender's Game. Ender's Game is one of my favorite science fiction books. And it ends with them sending Ender away. Like, he's gone. He's not coming back. Now, there is sort of like a vague sequel where he comes back, but it might as well not even be Ender Wiggin at that point.
I mean, his name is Ender.
Yeah. He's gone. He's never coming back. There are other books in the universe, but they're not very good. And Ender's not around, so I'm going to ignore them for the purpose of this argument. So, like I said, I like books or I shouldn't even say books. I like endings where we can't get back to the point we were before, right? Like, circumstances are irrevocably changed. And like I said, I would gladly trade more time with a particular character or in a particular world for a definitive conclusion that was planned.
I agree. That's kind of where I am. As long as the ending is planned and scaffolded in and clearly logically consistent, I will be pretty much okay with however it ends. It's when things feel rushed or the story doesn't come together or it's just logically not consistent where I have problems. Like, say, for example, if two characters were in love and were vying for the same throne and there was a conflict, like, you might want to marry them. Right. One of them might bring it up.
Yeah, hypothetically.
It'd be really weird if, for 6 episodes, like, the most obvious path is just hand-waved away instead of the principal characters ever having a discussion about it. That'd be super weird.
Yeah, fortunately, I don't think that would happen.
Yeah, that would totally never happen. Or, like, someone is kind of vacillating between fascism and revolutionary instincts, and then they just kind of do fascism out of nowhere.
Like super hard.
Just like super hard, and then no one asks them, like, hey, why'd you do fascism there instead of the other thing? And instead they were just like, we're just not going to talk about it.
Yeah, just double down.
Yeah, that would be super weird. Like, that's what I don't like.
Yeah,
but
agree with you.
If you get the payoff, like even in Mass Effect 3, which I thought was a little too neat in spots, but you get all the stories coming together, you get the major conflicts that you've been dealing with for the past 2 games, and you're going to finally decide, okay, who wins, the Geth or the Quarians? We'll have to decide this. Or, I forget the others. Do the Krogans get to have babies? Yes, no.
One of the other, I want to bring this up because it annoys me as well when you have these sort of open-ended universes. I think J.K. Rowling is the worst offender in this whole thing. Is you could just, like, if it's open, you can just make these sort of constant tweaks that just don't fit. I think the worst one is when she's like, yeah, turns out Dumbledore's gay. Like,
totally.
Fine, cool. Yeah, I love it that he is. That's great. But there is literally no indication at any point in any of the stories that he is. And you can't just do that.
He's fundamentally asexual as far as that original series 100%. Is concerned.
And that's the problem you get when you have these open sort of universes. You can make constant little tweaks and alterations, and suddenly it's canon. Like, that's unsatisfying. That's not how characters work.
Yeah, and what do you think riles us up about that? That these little contained bottle universes can just be punctured. Like, should it even bother us? That it's not like the story that we knew before someone opened their mouth ceases to exist, right? Like, Final Fantasy X-2's existence doesn't make Final Fantasy X a bad story just because you know that they're going to fuck it all up.
It's a good point.
And I just play 10 and I ignore 10-2 for the most part.
Yeah, so really it's a problem of... This is a fundamental analysis problem, really, when you think about it, right? Is that if you think about any sort of story, where do you basically how do you contain it, right? Like there's always a whole bunch of like actions that are going on off screen, right? Like we'll stick with Harry Potter for a second. Like presumably at some point in the what? How long is he at school? 7 years, 6 years?
Something like that, yeah. Every book's a year, right? So
Right.
well, but then Deathly Hallows is 2
There's
parts.
2, yeah. All right, so let's say 7 years, right? I'm sure someone will send us an email to correct us. In the 7 years at school, presumably Harry takes a shower at some point.
We hope.
We hope. But they never describe Harry showering. I'm glad they don't. It would be a weird book if they did. So presumably there's always some action that's occurring off screen. So like maybe Dumbledore was going on a whole bunch of dates, right? With a whole bunch of nice, male wizards. Fine.
Yep.
That's his life. Let him do whatever he wants. But the second you admit that a whole bunch of things are going on off screen and they can be filled in basically whatever way you want, then there's no way to interpret the story anymore. Right? Because maybe Dumbledore was just going out and murdering a whole bunch of people off screen, right? That's an equally relevant and conceivable way to fill in the story based on the evidence we have. So what annoys me about it is there's no way to interpret things. There are really no rules because you can do pretty much whatever you want.
Yeah. If it turned out Harry, every moment he wasn't on camera, was 9 feet tall.
Yeah. That would change things a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess ultimately stories are vehicles for meaning. And so as soon as you add complications to that meaning or alter it post hoc, it's not necessary. I use that term, right? Correctly?
Yeah, post hoc, yes.
Okay, good.
Correct.
Then all of a sudden the interpretations and knowledge you had before become contested in a way that's unsettling, especially if you felt you had a good handle on how things were going. Like, say, for example, if at the end of Final Fantasy VII they made a sequel movie where the Sephiroth comes back to life, that sure would fuck things up, wouldn't it?
Yeah, very much. Very much it would.
It's a good thing they didn't do that.
No, excellent.
Thank goodness.
Yeah, as much as postmodernism wants to argue that the text has no boundaries, it's a difficult way to live, right? In the same way that like the radical skeptic might want to say like, oh, existence is a simulation. Nothing here is really real. You can't live that way from day to day. You can't read if you say the text has no boundaries. Everything is part of it.
Yeah, and while the text definitely breathes in from the world around it and consumes bits of the world around it, and knowing elements about the author or about the time period add context to the story, it is not all one large story.
No. They're boundaries. Even if they're hazy and sort of hard to delineate perfectly, there are boundaries somewhere.
I think that makes sense. Yeah. And so, of these conclusions we've discussed, like, did any of them sit with you especially well, or
I was
poorly?
willing to forgive Game of Thrones. They backed themselves into a corner where they only had 6 episodes left to do what they needed to do. I wasn't happy about it, but I'm willing to forgive them.
Apparently they had an offer of as many episodes or budget as they needed, and they said 6.
Yeah, they wanted to go do the Star Wars trilogy, which, again, just circles back to another franchise that's continuing indefinitely.
I guess my larger issue with that is not necessarily how I think I have the same problem that most people did. It's not where it ended, it's how they got there. That was the problem.
Yeah, it was very strange.
It was fast-forwarded in some spots, and also there were moments where they just felt like they had to have lingering shots, or they had to delve into the violence of a moment, when if they could have just cut that in half and spent more time explaining why we got there, it felt almost like a war show for a few episodes there.
I didn't need, a few minutes of Arya riding around on a white horse.
Yeah, I didn't need her running through the streets for 30 minutes.
No.
Like, you probably could have taken that 30 minutes, budgeted it, and instead said, hey, what if Dany and Jon had a conversation? Right. Like any conversation that matters this whole season.
Yeah, what if Jon wasn't just, like, weirdly ignoring her constantly? As if that would make anything easier.
Yeah. Yeah, I liked Avengers conclusion. I'm okay with that. Like, fine, go forth with a new universe now. You found how to make some of these characters interesting. Good for you. Magic storyline seems like it'll be fine. I don't care about the storyline that much. None of these characters matter to me outside of their cards for the most part. Like, they're cool, but I don't care whether they live or die because their cards will still play the same.
Yeah, so that was going to be my first question. Is this doesn't have anything to do with the cards that have already come out, right?
No, it won't like ban cards.
Okay.
Like, it's not like the cards where the guy who died are in them. They're just invalid now.
Yeah,
so
just tear them in half.
It's actually adds to my sense that if something is good and then a later addition to the fiction screws it up, kind of who cares because the good stuff's still there.
Yeah.
Like, hey, a character died in Magic. His old cards are still good. They're still very playable. If you want to see what he was up to, here you go. Here's one of the older ones.
I think it's just worth mentioning at this point as well, Go Tell a Watchman, the quote-unquote sequel to To Kill a Mockingbird.
Oh,
I
thought that was the sequel to Watchmen.
No. Like Harper Lee, were she of sound mind, I don't think she ever wanted this. But other people got their grubby hands on it, and suddenly it's out there. So, like, even in cases where, maybe a sequel was never even intended, considering this was written as a first draft of To Kill a Mockingbird, even that's not always enough to stop the culture industry from doing what it wants anyway.
Yeah, and I don't think that Arthur Conan Doyle would have wanted the Will Ferrell
No.
Sherlock Holmes movie.
I don't think anybody did.
And it turns out no one did. So I think that's most of what I've got in terms of conclusions. I think that my takeaway from this is that having a small circumscribed world just allows you a lot more freedom when you're operating in small spaces. And if you keep the existential out of it, or you keep franchise considerations out of it, the story itself can hold a lot more import than if you have to add things onto it and keep that possibility space open.
I agree. I think it's narratively and dramatically more interesting, but it necessarily limits your income streams, which is a problem if you're a professional media producer of some sort.
Yeah. So thank you, Pete. And just for everyone listening, Crazy Ex-Girlfriend is still a good show. It's on Netflix, all the seasons.
I will check it. I will add it to my list. One last Sherlock Holmes fact. The phrase "elementary, my dear Watson" never appears in the stories.
Are you telling me that it's fan fiction?
It might have been in one of the movies. I don't know. But I know Arthur Conan Doyle never wrote the phrase "elementary, my dear Watson."
Weirdly enough, in one of his notes in one of the original manuscripts, it said he would never say "elementary, my dear Watson."
What is he, a tool?
So all of us have...
Like back then.
He's rolling in his grave.
That's fine. He believed a lot of weird stuff, too.
So, well, thank you, Pete.
Yep. Yeah, always a pleasure, especially when we get to talk about high-level narrative theory like this.
Thank you, listeners, and if you want to get in touch with the show, another reminder, at DeepListensPod on Twitter, deeplistens.libsyn.com. We've got our comment sections, and deeplistenspodcast@gmail.com. Till next time, peace!